Hello, my name is Ruth Mutson, and I'm a Community Involvement Coordinator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'd like to welcome you to this virtual public meeting regarding EPA's proposed cleanup plan for the Rolls-Royce Plant 5 and Plant 8 facility. If you've been to other EPA public meetings, you can see that we have adjusted our meeting format to help ensure public safety during the ongoing COVID-19 health crisis. We hope that you find this presentation and our outreach methods helpful and informative. This virtual meeting will provide some background information on the Rolls-Royce Plant 5 and Plant 8 facility and the work overseen by EPA. We will also provide you with details about the investigation at the facility and EPA's proposed cleanup plan. EPA issued a document called a Statement of Basis to describe the proposed cleanup plan and gather the public's comments and questions about the plan. After a 45-day public comment period, EPA will provide responses to public questions and comments in a final decision document. There are many ways you can submit your questions or comments to EPA. First, you can submit a comment directly on this website at https://www.epa.gov/HW Corrective Action Sites/Waste-Cleanup-Rolls-Royce-Indianapolis-Indiana. You can also find the Statement of Basis on this website. Next, you can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-6595, or you can email me at mutson.ruth@epa.gov. Finally, you can mail your written or typed comments to Ruth Mutson at the U.S. EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, Chicago, Illinois, 60604. We understand that you may have questions regarding the proposed cleanup plan after watching this presentation. We invite you to join EPA representatives during an open question and answer session on December 8th from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dial 312-667-5632 and enter the conference code 1344648 when prompted. Once again, that number is 312-667-5632 with the conference code 1344648. I will now hand the presentation over to one of the EPA project managers, Joseph Kelly, to explain the proposed cleanup plan and provide background information on the Rolls-Royce facility.
Hi, thanks, Ruth. Again, my name is Joseph Kelly, and I'm an EPA project manager in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act Corrective Action Program, also known as RCRA. Jennifer Stanhope and I are the project managers for the Rolls-Royce facility. Over the next few slides, we will describe some of the investigation and cleanup activities previously performed at the site. We will also discuss EPA's recommended cleanup plan. The facility is currently owned by Rolls-Royce and includes two industrial properties called Plant 5 and Plant 8, which are located at 2355 and 2001 South Tibbs Avenue in Indianapolis, Indiana. The plants are separated by Raymond Street, which runs east to west. Plant 8 lies north of Raymond Street and Plant 5 to the south. Eagle Creek is on the eastern boundary of Plant 8. Rolls-Royce operates both plants to produce turbine engines for commercial and military aircraft. However, operation of the facility dates back to World War II, when the government-owned Defense Plant Corporation constructed and began operating Plant 5. General Motors and Allison Engine Company also owned and operated the facility before Rolls-Royce. Today, Plant 5 is used for manufacturing, and Plant 8 is used for research and development. Manufacturing processes include machining, cleaning, plating, and painting. Rolls-Royce uses solvents, oils, and fuels during these processes. Investigation and cleanup of the facility through the RCRA Corrective Action Program began in 2001 and included an evaluation of the various wastes generated as a result of the historic operations. Rolls-Royce has already completed soil and groundwater cleanups in several areas of the facility. EPA's proposed cleanup plan will put in place the final pieces to ensure human health and the environment are protected into the future. The plan requires Rolls-Royce to continue collecting groundwater and soil vapor samples to confirm contaminant levels remain acceptable. It requires Rolls-Royce to keep in place existing legal controls and add more controls to prevent human exposure to site contaminants. It also includes flexibility to address any newly discovered contamination or identified concerns resulting from this ongoing sampling. The following slides will provide more detail on the RCRA program and how EPA selected this proposed remedy. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, was created to regulate companies that treat, store, or dispose of hazardous wastes. It created laws for the proper handling of hazardous waste in order to prevent those sites from becoming future Superfund sites. Superfund sites often use EPA resources and taxpayer dollars to investigate and clean up contamination at facilities because they have already become inactive. RCRA seeks to limit the use of taxpayer dollars by giving EPA the authority and responsibility to oversee the cleanup of hazardous wastes by the owners of those facilities while they're still active. The owner or responsible party, in this case Rolls-Royce, is legally obligated to follow EPA guidance and must receive EPA's approval on all elements of the project. EPA conducts this work at the Rolls-Royce facility under a RCRA Corrective Action Administrative Order. My co-project manager, Jennifer Stanhope, will provide more detail about the investigation and the proposed remedy.
Thanks, Joseph. Again, my name is Jennifer Stanhope, and I am also a RCRA Corrective Action Project Manager. The initial RCRA facility investigation, or RFI, at Rolls-Royce was conducted from October 2001 to April 2003. 42 areas of interest, also called AOIs or areas, were investigated to determine whether any significant spills had occurred. Soil, sediment, groundwater, surface water, and biological samples were analyzed. Rolls-Royce also conducted investigations on the facility property and in the neighborhood to the south to determine whether vapors coming from contamination in the ground were entering into buildings through a process called vapor intrusion. Chemicals were detected above relevant soil and groundwater screening criteria during the investigation at the Rolls-Royce facility. These chemicals include a variety of chlorinated volatile organic compounds, or CVOCs, such as the solvents perchloroethylene, or PCE, and trichloroethene, or TCE. Other solvents and chemicals that are produced when solvents break down in the environment were also identified, as well as petroleum hydrocarbons and metals. The investigation identified solvent contamination migrating off-site in groundwater from the southwest corner of the site. A later slide will show this in more detail. This figure shows in red the areas studied at Plant 8. The areas with impacts were defined by collecting samples in a phased approach. If contamination was identified above EPA screening levels in any location, additional samples were collected in all directions until the measured contaminant levels in the samples were below screening levels. The green, blue, black, and purple labels on this figure show the locations where samples were collected during the initial investigation. 3 additional phases of study were performed to fully characterize the nature and extent of the releases identified. This figure shows in red the areas that were studied at Plant 5. The Plant 5 property contains a former waste disposal area called a surface impoundment. The location is shown on the figure. The surface impoundment is classified as a landfill and was closed in accordance with applicable laws. In 1999, General Motors obtained ownership of the closed surface impoundment from Rolls-Royce to manage the post-closure care. In 2011, the Revitalizing Auto Communities Environmental Response, or RACER, Trust was formed to manage environmental assets from the General Motors bankruptcy. Racer Trust continues to be responsible for the post-closure maintenance of the surface impoundment. So for purposes of this cleanup project, the surface impoundment is not considered part of the Rolls-Royce site. This figure shows the sample locations at Plant 5. Just like Plant 8, data was collected using a phased approach to define the full extent of the contamination. Also like Plant 8, the green, blue, black, and purple labels show the locations where samples were collected during the initial investigation. Cleanup actions are sometimes conducted at facilities before the final remedy is approved to quickly address threats to human health and the environment that may pose a more immediate concern. These actions are called interim measures. Interim measures at the Rolls-Royce facility included soil excavation at Plant 8 and installation and operation of 6 remediation systems at Plant 5. The following slides will describe these activities in more detail. The yellow circle on this figure shows the location of the interim measure that was completed in Area 8-31 at Plant 8. Soil in this area was excavated in 2 separate phases to address a release of mercury. A total of approximately 135 tons of soil were excavated and disposed at an off-site landfill. Confirmation samples collected after the second phase of excavation indicated levels of residual mercury in the soil were below EPA screening levels. Rolls-Royce also implemented interim measures for 8 areas at Plant 5, which are shown in yellow, to begin cleaning up the contamination while the facility developed the final remedy. An air sparge and soil vapor extraction system was installed and operated in each area to remove solvents and hydrocarbons from soil and groundwater. Additional sampling has confirmed that all the systems installed in these areas have met their goals to remove contamination and are no longer operating. Soil vapor extraction, also called SVE, and air sparging are often used together to clean up both soil and groundwater. The graphic on this slide shows how an SVE and air sparge system works. SVE removes or extracts harmful chemicals in the form of vapors from the soil above the water table. Vapors are the gases that form when chemicals evaporate. The vapors are removed from the ground by using a vacuum to pull the vapors out. Air sparging uses air to help remove contaminants from polluted soil and groundwater below the water table. The chemicals evaporate faster when air is pumped underground, making them easier to remove using a vacuum. Certain chemicals, like the solvents and fuel found at the Rolls-Royce facility, evaporate easily, and SVE and air sparging work best on these types of chemicals. Air pollution control equipment collects the air and vapors that are pulled out of the ground with the vacuum. The harmful vapors are separated from the clean air, and the clean air is then released. The 2 primary groundwater contaminants at the Rolls-Royce facility are PCE and TCE. This figure shows the current extent, or boundaries, of the PCE in groundwater at Plant 5. The air sparging and soil vapor extraction systems removed much of the contamination, and concentrations of PCE are lower now than before Rolls-Royce operated these systems. Rolls-Royce developed a mathematical model which uses collected groundwater data to predict how the remaining contaminants will migrate in the future. They periodically compare the concentrations measured in the groundwater to the model to confirm it is accurately predicting contaminant movement at the facility. This figure shows the current extent of TCE in groundwater at Plant 5. Like PCE, the concentrations are considerably lower than originally measured in many areas as a result of the interim measures conducted at the facility. TCE is migrating in groundwater off the site to the southeast. Rolls-Royce is monitoring the off-site concentrations of TCE by conducting ongoing sampling of the monitoring wells shown on the figure to the southeast of the facility. The groundwater model developed for the facility has accurately predicted this migration off the site. Contaminant concentrations measured in soil and groundwater at the site were compared to EPA screening levels to evaluate whether they pose a potential risk. The screening levels consider possible human health effects and possible effects in the environment, such as impact to wildlife. When a sample is above a screening level, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing any harm or presenting a risk. It means that the collected data needs to move on to the next phase of study, which is called a risk assessment. Risk assessments are used in many fields of study to determine the specific type and amount of risk in each scenario. The original RCRA facility investigation report included a baseline risk assessment that was later updated in 2010 and 2012 using new data. The Human Health Risk Assessment evaluated the health risk for people at or near the facility. It considered workers on and off the facility, possible trespassers at the facility, and residents living near the facility. EPA agreed with Rolls-Royce's conclusion that contaminants in soil and groundwater pose no significant human health risks for the current and planned future use of the facility. A vapor intrusion risk assessment determined that nearby residents are not at risk of vapors from contaminated soil and groundwater migrating into indoor spaces. Additional sampling will be conducted in the residential neighborhood to monitor whether there are any changes in potential risk to residents. Rolls-Royce will also further evaluate the potential on-site risk from vapor intrusion. An ecological risk assessment conducted for areas at the facility with potential wildlife, including the 2 ponds at Plant 8, concluded it is unlikely the facility poses an unacceptable ecological risk. The groundwater model has also been used to determine whether off-site migration of contamination poses a risk to wildlife in Eagle Creek, which lies east of the site. The predicted groundwater concentrations at the creek do not pose a risk to creek wildlife. The cleanup alternatives that were thoroughly studied and considered are presented here. The first alternative is to conduct no action. This was included as a baseline to evaluate the other alternatives. It is not considered further in the statement of basis analysis because it is not protective of human health and the environment. Alternative 2 is a monitoring-only program to evaluate groundwater flow and quality conditions in the vicinity of plants 5 and 8. This alternative would evaluate the conclusions of the groundwater model. Rolls-Royce would develop a sampling plan that would specify where and how often samples would be collected and what contaminants to measure. Monitoring would be conducted for up to 30 years. Groundwater samples would also be collected for a set of contaminants that EPA has recently started studying, called PFAS, in areas of the facility where the history suggests they might be present. Soil gas and other samples would be collected to further study vapor intrusion at the facility and in the neighborhood to the south. Alternative 3 involves restarting all the air sparge and soil vapor extraction systems previously operated as interim measures at the facility. The systems removed by Rolls-Royce would be reinstalled, and all systems would operate for up to 5 years. Rolls-Royce would also conduct up to 30 years of groundwater monitoring. Alternative 4 would include conducting remediation using a technology called in situ chemical oxidation. Rolls-Royce would install injection wells in areas of groundwater containing PCE above a threshold concentration. A chemical solution would be injected into the ground to break down the contaminants into harmless byproducts, such as carbon dioxide and water. Rolls-Royce would also conduct up to 30 years of groundwater monitoring as part of this alternative. All the cleanup alternatives except Alternative 1 would also include facility-wide management controls. These are designed to ensure long-term protection of human health and the environment. A legal tool called an Environmental Restrictive Covenant, or ERC, would be put in place to prevent the use of the property for residential purposes and to make sure future occupants are protected from possible exposure via vapor intrusion. The ERC would also prevent improper handling of potentially contaminated soil or groundwater. It would require a legal restriction called a no-well zone that prevents the use of groundwater for drinking. The ERC would be recorded on the deed of the property to notify potential future owners and lessees that groundwater contamination is present and that use of the groundwater is restricted. EPA uses established selection criteria to choose a cleanup plan at facilities in the RCRA Corrective Action Program. First, a cleanup alternative must meet 3 threshold criteria to be further considered by EPA. These criteria are requirements of every RCRA cleanup. At the Rolls-Royce facility, Alternative 1 does not meet the first threshold criteria, which is protecting human health and the environment, and is eliminated from consideration. All the other alternatives can meet the first criteria and the second threshold criteria of achieving the cleanup goals. Remediation conducted during the interim measures at the facility removed the sources of contamination, so additional work is not needed to meet the third threshold criteria. Alternatives 2, 3, and 4 all meet the threshold criteria. Next, 7 balancing criteria are used to compare the alternatives that have met the threshold criteria. The balancing criteria provide a way to identify the most effective cleanup strategy while maintaining the flexibility needed to address a wide range of scenarios. Balancing criteria 5 considers the cost of the alternatives. Alternatives 3 and 4 would remove additional contamination compared to alternative 2, but will cost more to implement. EPA has determined that the remaining contaminants in the soil and groundwater do not pose significant risks under the current and expected future land use at and around the facility. This means the risk of exposure makes it unnecessary to use additional resources to remove the remaining contamination. EPA proposes implementing Alternative 2 at the facility since it best meets the evaluation criteria. This alternative would require Rolls-Royce to conduct groundwater monitoring to confirm contaminant concentrations do not pose a risk to human health or the environment. Rolls-Royce would also be required to conduct additional PFAS and vapor intrusion investigations. The existing no-well zone that prevents groundwater exposure would be maintained, and additional environmental restrictive covenants would be put in place. The remedy also includes flexibility to address any newly discovered contamination or identified concerns resulting from the PFAS and vapor intrusion investigations. EPA will issue a final decision documenting the selected remedy after the public comment period on the statement of basis has ended. The final decision will include summary responses to public comments received on the statement of basis. The selected remedy will be put in place after EPA issues the final decision and response to comments document. The document will be added to the facility website and administrative record. This concludes the technical portion of our presentation, and I will now hand the presentation back to Ruth.
Thank you for participating in this virtual public meeting. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are multiple ways to submit your public comments on this proposed cleanup plan. First, you can submit a comment directly on this website at https://www.epa.gov/HW Corrective Action Sites/hazardous-waste-cleanup-Rolls-Royce-Indianapolis-Indiana. Next, you can leave a confidential voicemail at 312-886-6595. You can also email me at mudson.ruth@epa.gov or mail your written or typed statement to Ruth Mudson at the U.S. EPA, 77 West Jackson Boulevard, 19th floor, Chicago, Illinois, 60604. And of course, if you have any questions or need assistance with submitting a comment, you can contact myself, Jennifer Stanhope, or Joseph Kelly. Thanks again.